Hello, everyone. Welcome to our seminar here. We are going to get started in just a second. I am not going to share the display because I want you to enjoy a little avant-garde music here as we get going. So if you'll give us just 2 minutes as you come in, you're listening to the dulcet tones of George Antheil. All right, well, welcome everyone. This is our presentation on Hemingway and the Little Modernist magazines. My name is Kirk Kernut, and I am a member of the Hemingway Society board. And we are delighted to have you here with us today as we talk about the modernist movement and the role little magazines played within them. The goal of this webinar was to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Hemingway's first appearance with the vignettes from In Our Time in the Little Review's Exile number. And we were thinking in particular how we might, what we wanted to talk about. And one of the things that I was remembering is when I started my career. By the way, I'm sitting here at 27 Rue de Fleurus, if you haven't noticed that. And there's my dear friend Gertrude Stein back there. That's why my head keeps fading in and out. But a book that was out right as I started my career was this one by Julian Simons called Makers of the New. And within it, he talks about most of the familiar faces: Wyndham Lewis, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, James Joyce. But he also talks about several what we might call more eccentric folks. And in particular, I have always had in my mind one particular modernist that I knew nothing about, named Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. So when we started talking about what we might do with this webinar, I thought, let's do Hemingway and some of the modernists who may be a little less well-known, and try to triangulate him and the literary marketplace within the spectrum of what is experimental, what's avant-garde, and how folks define themselves in that across that broad range of identities. I should say that Julian Simmons defines the Baroness as one of the genuine phonies, meaning that she is someone who really sort of associated herself with modernism, but was not a true artist. She believed in herself, but was not a true artist. And I think that reputation has changed quite a bit over the past 36 or 37 years. So we have three wonderful presentations by three scholars that I admire very much. I will be introducing them before each presentation. Then I've got a series of questions for them. And then after that, we will throw the floor open. However, I did want to let you know that you are welcome to jump into the Q&A at any point and start listing questions that may pop up for you. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker. And we're going to go in alphabetical order, I should mention. All of these names, I'm sure that everybody here is going to recognize. But it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Julie Goodspeed Chadwick, who is a Chancellor's Professor of English and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Indiana University, Purdue University, Columbus, where she also served as an IU Bicentennial Professor during the extended bicentennial, and where she directs the Office of Student Research. Her books include Modernist Women Writers and War, Trauma and the Female Body, and Juna Barnes, HD, and Gertrude Stein, a book that I am absolutely a fan of, and Gertrude and Reclaiming Asiya Wevel, Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, and the Literary Imagination. She's co-editor of the collected writings of Sia Wevel, which is a recipient of a 2022 Susan Koppelman Award for the best anthology, multi-authored or edited book in feminist studies and popular American culture from the Popular Culture Association. She regularly teaches Hemingway and is thrilled to have this opportunity to connect with members of the Hemingway Society. So, Julie, I'm going to enable you to share your screen, and then I am going to remove my face and allow you to just take the floor.
I am really thrilled to be here with you all. Initially, when I was invited to be a part of this session, I was asked whether I could talk about modernist women's writing in connection with the spring 1923, the little review issue, also called Exile's Number. And as I began thinking about this presentation, it occurred to me that what little magazines do is really follow the practice of interleaving. So I realized that texts are layered in alternating fashion, that authors are also listed one after the other, sometimes appearing again in the table of contents, as we see with Ernest Hemingway. But then we also have texts layered, alternating fashion as well. And so with this practice of interleaving, then what we see is a conversation and a connection, a kind of network that organically springs up among authors and texts and issues, and then volumes, right? Like these all like slot into each other under the masthead of the little magazine. And so I think this is really quite fascinating to think about how these pieces in their original form, in terms of how their contemporaries first encountered them, how we now can access them through our digital technologies, and think about how we can receive them and access them. So initially, this practice of interleaving came out of my teaching. So I teach Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein in tandem with each other. So I teach their works in concert in, for instance, an introduction to fiction course. And so I teach something like Big Two-Hearted River from In Our Time, and I teach Stein's prose portrait Picasso with that, because what I ultimately found is that while Hemingway initially seems more accessible to students, and Stein seems incredibly inaccessible, by teaching them together or by reading them together, for instance, in this issue of the Little Review, what we find is that Stein helps us to see how indeed complex and sophisticated Hemingway's texts are, and then Hemingway allows us access to a pathway into Stein. And so if you're interested in the teaching component of it, I do have a chapter in Teaching Hemingway Modernism, in which I document how I teach Big Two-Hearted River in concert with Picasso. So what we find in these texts is that both Hemingway and Stein end up using omission when using words that we purportedly know the meaning of. We know the denotations of these words. They are words that we seemingly can pin down. And yet they underscore the complexity of these texts. They point covertly to a theme or a story or a narrative or something that is seemingly there, but not articulated, right? So it haunts or animates the text. James Gifford refers to Hemingway's theory of omission as a more nuanced extension of the show not tell principle, in which the absent matter can be detected by its influence on those things that do appear in the text. And so Kirk passed along to me the Modernist Versions Project texts In Our Time, and they all made peace. What is peace? And so these were pulled from the Little Review, the Exile's Number. And what I love about this is that Gifford treats them in an interleaving fashion. And so as you can see, they appear in different places in the table of contents. They're not exactly the same text, and yet they're coupled together in a way in which we can read them in intertextual fashion. And so I think that's a really wonderful example of how the little magazines do indeed promote this practice of interleaving. I think too, something that we want to think about. So when we have these writers juxtaposed one after the other, the texts can stand alone. But for instance, with the early vignettes from In Our Time with Hemingway, you'll see that butting up right against it is Stein's I Dem the Same, a Valentine to Sherwood Anderson. So while that is not about Hemingway, right, per se, you can't help but move from one text to another if you're reading it straight through. And so I'm going to focus briefly in my presentation, my time here, with I Dem the Same, a Valentine to Sherwood Anderson. And so I want to provide some context in which I gesture to Hemingway as we think about how to access and how to read this really avant-garde text. In an August 15th, 1924 letter to Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, Hemingway writes, "Isn't writing a hard job though? It used to be easy before I met you." However, as J. Gerald Kennedy and Kirk Kernutt document, in 1924, the year that letter was written, Hemingway was determined to throw off the influence of his mentor. He wanted to establish his independence from her. And we see that in the contextual and intertextual reading of Soldier's Home, which is collected in this really lovely critical edition of In Our Time, which has been recently published. So some more context. I Dem the Same, a Valentine to Sherwood Anderson, revels in ambiguity and even contradictions. And that perhaps parallels Hemingway's conflicting feelings about Stein as a mentor. What is really fascinating about I Dem the Same is that in its manuscript form, it was purportedly a text about Stein's partner, Toklas. And so Stein renovated that text, and that's actually Michael North's word, which I think is just a brilliant word to describe what's happening. So Stein renovated that text to make it appear as a Valentine exchanged for the Valentine of a preface that Sherwood Anderson wrote for Stein's geography and plays. So North posits that what may be happening with this text is that in publishing I Dem the Same, Stein delivered a public Valentine to Anderson and simultaneously a private one to Toklas. Now, conversely, also a possibility that North floats is that perhaps Stein was playing an elaborate joke on Anderson, that in the manuscript form, so when we read I Dem the Same in manuscript form, we realize that by the time of publication, Stein had replaced the word Stein, so she had actually written her name in the manuscript, with the word mine by the time of publication. And so one reading of that is then what she could be doing, instead of issuing this Valentine to Anderson as a kind of thank you for the very laudatory preface he wrote for geography and plays, is that what she may be doing is, in fact, replicating or duplicating the sentiment, that admiration in the preface, and just duplicating it and centering herself in I Dem the Same. So those are two possibilities. But I also think it's likely that Stein may have simply repurposed this text, that it was a work in progress, it was a draft in progress, and that in fact, she wanted to show her admiration for Anderson's work, but also her appreciation of his friendship and support. Because we are talking about Stein, I do think that all of these possibilities may be true all at the same time. I do think what we can say with certainty is that I Dem the Same brings to mind what Marjorie Perloff calls the strangeness of the ordinary. Okay. So Hemingway was 23 when he arrived in Paris, and he had a letter of introduction from Anderson to Stein. And so he met Stein in 1922. Stein helped him place literary work. They immediately became friends. He viewed her as a mentor in the beginning, and that mentoring relationship fell apart and turned sour. One interpretation is that Hemingway viewed himself as a teacher then rather than a student. And yet both Stein and Anderson viewed him as a student. And I'm sure people in attendance know more about this relationship than I do. But I think what is fascinating is that, as we see in this table of contents, as well as what we know in terms of biographical contexts, all of these writers are connected. So we have Ernest Hemingway in the table of contents. We have a piece purportedly, putatively, about Sherwood Anderson. And then we have pieces by Gertrude Stein as well. And so, in fact, we see interleaving at work. Okay. So what I thought I would do is I was asked to allow us to have like a flavor of this little magazine, and I'm going to focus on this text in particular to give us a sense of it. So I thought I would read just pieces of it, some passages, and offer some commentary. So it begins, I done the same, a Valentine to Sherwood Anderson. I knew too that through them, I knew too that he was through. I knew too that he threw them. I knew too that they were through. I knew too, I knew too, I knew them. I knew to them. If they tear a hunter through, if they tear through a hunter, if they tear through a hunt and a hunter, if they tear through the different sizes of the six, which are these: a woman with a white package under one arm and a black package under the other arm, and dressed in brown with a white blouse, the second St. Joseph, the third a hunter in a blue coat and black garters and a plaid cap. A fourth, a knife grinder, who is full-faced, and a very little woman with black hair and a yellow hat, and an excellently smiling appropriate soldier. All these as you please. In the meantime, examples of the same lily. In this way, please, have you rung? This sketches the mundane, the ordinary, but it also pinpoints the individual and begins to highlight subjectivity. There is a specificity embedded in these details, and various people make up this microcosmic world. And what I think is really fascinating about this piece is that at times it's prose, at times it's poetry. So this prose poem, and here it reads as if it's prose. And this is rather suggestive of Anderson in Winesburg, Ohio. And in fact, Anderson cites Stein's Picasso, which I had mentioned at the top of this presentation at the beginning. He cites that as an influence in Winesburg and on Winesburg, Ohio. So I think that Stein understood that he threw his characters into being. He altered the landscape of American literature, to borrow a word from Stein in this piece. But according to Stein, quote, really except Sherwood, there was no one in America who could write a clear and passionate sentence. And that's from the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. When Anderson died in 1941, Stein wrote a tribute. And he was everything, and he did everything. She truly admired him, and it's not unreasonable then that she would write a literary Valentine to him. And in fact, we might expect her to gesture to, or even take on some semblance of Anderson's style, as she does with Picasso in her Cubist prose portrait of him. So it appears to me that Stein embarked on the same kind of modernist, innovative project as Anderson in I Dem the Same. They are working toward the same experimental aesthetic, what we might call examples of the same lily. What do I see? A very little snail, a medium-sized turkey, a small band of sheep, a fair orange tree. All nice wives are like that. Listen to them from here. Oh, you did not have an answer. Here, yes. Nice wives are like that and over there. And so in linguistics, that's called a deixis, this figurative pointing. The we of the poem, the speaker and maybe the addressee, can listen to the wives from where they are together, conversing together. It closes affirmatively with this yes and a comma. There's more to come. And the intimacy of this piece is reminiscent of and perhaps recalls Emily Dickinson's poem, I'm Nobody, Who Are You? The next part, a very Valentine. Very fine is my Valentine, very fine and very mine. Very mine is my Valentine, very mine and very fine. Very fine is my Valentine and mine. Very fine, very mine, and mine is my Valentine. So this section reads as a Valentine, or perhaps it mimics one. And questions that we might think about that I don't have ready answers to. What does it mean to have a Valentine and to write one as a queer lesbian to a straight man? So there is a kinship, there's a love and friendship, and there are kindred spirits at work, in work, and that's established in the personal and professional relationships and lives of Stein and Anderson. But as Stein would learn from her friendship with Hemingway, friendships can be rocky, trying, and uneven, as we see in Why Do You Feel Differently? Why do you feel differently about a very little snail and a big one? Why do you feel differently about a medium-sized turkey and a very large one? Why do you feel differently about a small band of sheep and several sheep that are writing? And then you can see in this list, not to be, do they please, not to be, do they not please? And so you can see this just alternating back and forth. And so what we can say is that personal differences and or professional ones can crop up. And in the world of this section, neither the you nor the speaker presumes to be a nice wife. And you can see, and I actually skipped over some lines for the sake of time, but you can see on page 6, oh, very well, all nice wives are like that. And so these, the people who are separate from these nice wives do feel differently. They see and perceive the world, as well as art and language and expression, presumably differently. And they may or may not be pleased. Okay, so bundles for them, a history of giving bundles. I think this is really interesting because in the Little Review Exiles number, this is listed as a separate text. It follows immediately idem the same, but in the Library of America collection of Stein's work, which is edited by Catherine Simpson and Harriet Chessman, it's treated as one text, like in this interleaving fashion. So I thought that was a pretty neat occurrence. So in Bundles for Them, the second half of this is a love poem with more conventional conceits. And so I think it's really fascinating to read this in intertextual fashion, like in this interleaving practice with idem the same, because this sounds like a Valentine, but it recasts the gender. So in fact, perhaps these are Valentines for two different people. If you hear her snore, it is not before you love her. You love her, so that to be her beau is very lovely. She is sweetly there, and her curly hair is very lovely. She is sweetly here, and I am very near, and that is very lovely. She is my tender sweet, and her little feet are stretched out well, which is a treat and very lovely. So that's very sweet. These pieces, I think, do function as Valentines for Anderson and okay, in this way. What I'll say about this in passing, it begins with please, please. And so we might think about the fact that, I mean, much like Tender Buttons, in which the first prose poem, A Carafe That Is a Blind Glass, can be read as a kind of manifesto or an opening poem that allows you into the rest of the buttons of Tender Buttons. This piece, in this way, is asking for entry, right? It's asking for a way to kind of like unlock these texts. And in fact, the words will guide us. What I think is really neat about the session is we have Hemingway, who is very experimental. And then we have Stein, who's also very experimental and who seems more avant-garde and inaccessible. And then we have like the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, who seems just incredibly inaccessible and even more avant-garde than Stein. And so it seems like it's a spectrum, but really I think it's a matter of degree rather than kind. So keys, please. And so the words will lead us, they will show us in this way how to read these texts. It's emphasized that it's useless to be alarming. We understand these words, we can make sense of them, but we also have to be okay with perhaps not having neat and tidy and pat interpretations. Let us describe. I think this is such a brilliant way to end the pieces, like to come full circle with Stein's texts in the spring 1923 issue of the Little Review, because this, in fact, recalls the beginning of I Dem the Same. Let us describe how they went. And yet, what's different about this is that it feels like it's a walk, it's a journey, right? That's going to kind of cycle back around. It was a very windy night, and the road, although in excellent condition and extremely well graded, has many turnings. And although the curves are not sharp, the rise is considerable. It was a very windy night, and some of the larger vehicles found it more prudent not to venture. In consequence, some of those who had planned to go were unable to do so. Many others did go, and there was a sacrifice of what shall we, a sheep, a hen, a cock, a village, a ruin, and all that and then that having been blessed, let us bless it. And this, for me, anticipates the story or the poem as a journey, as a walk. It anticipates that postmodern manifesto, A Poem as a Walk by A.R. Ammons from 1967. So I've mentioned this piece now several times. This is the I'm just going to offer a few words about this. This is the prose portrait of Picasso, and these are the images from the 1912 issue of Camera Work in which it appeared. And so this is what Anderson himself would have read by Stein, and that influenced Winesburg, Ohio. And so he's the one who provided a letter of introduction for Hemingway to meet Stein. So, I mean, they all are very like intricately bound. So in closing my presentation, I'll say that this is another issue of the Little Review. This is the 1920 issue, and it features a piece. We actually think of it as, it's called Manifesto by the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, the Modest Woman, which is under the discussion section. And this is the way that it appeared in the Little Review. And so what she's doing in this piece, I mean, it's actually so amusing to read, because the Baroness was a Dadaist. She was one of the first Dada practitioners in the United States. And in fact, she had a ready-made in 1913 with enduring ornament. And just to kind of put that in context, Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain was originated in 1917. And so we can talk more about the Baroness, and in fact, I think other people will, but I have a lot of notes. So if you want to ask me about the Baroness, I'd be happy to talk about her. What I'll say, though, about the Little Review, they were proud to publish the Baroness. This piece is very Dadaist in that she insults the very audience that she's appealing to. So she is championing James Joyce's Ulysses in these pages. She admires his brazenness, his excess. Nothing is off limits to him, and she thinks nothing should be off limits to her. So she identifies with him and his aesthetic. And then I also have, this is actually from a book on modernist manifestos. I thought this was a little bit easier to read. And so if you want to shoot me an email, I'd be happy to send you these images, although you can find these, I mean, fairly easily online. And so what I'll say in closing is that the Baroness seemed unreadable to many in her day. I mean, she had advocates, for instance, in Juna Barnes, and also Ernest Hemingway, who did not view her as a phony. And so we learn from Maddox Ford's memoirs that Hemingway published her in the Transatlantic Review, much to Ford's dismay. And this is a quote from his memoirs. Mr. Hemingway assisted me by trying to insert as a serial the complete works of Baroness von Freytag-Loringhoven. I generally turned around in time to take them out of the contents table. But when I paid my month's visit to New York, he took charge and accomplished his purpose at the expense of cutting other pieces. So he still managed to publish the Baroness, which I thought was really quite hilarious. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Julie. And I think it's very important to recognize that, Stein and the Baroness have a lot of differences, but I think foremost among them is Stein was, of course, very anti-Joyce. So it's interesting that the similarities are probably that Stein herself was often wrongly referred to as a Dadaist just because of her wordplay and her playful style. So thank you very much. That was really wonderful. I think one of the things to think about out of Julie's talk is the fact that there's a presumption out there that Sherwood Anderson was really only useful to Gertrude Stein as a promoter of her own work, and that she may not have seen much modernist devices or techniques to recommend in his own work. And I think you've given us a little bit of a means to challenge that idea by looking at these pieces, which are not widely known, certainly not as widely known as he and they Hemingway and others. So our second presenter is Michelle E. Moore, who is professor of English at the College of DuPage. She's the author of a book that I think we are all very familiar with, Chicago in the Making of American Modernism, Cather, Hemingway, Faulkner, and Fitzgerald in Conflict from Bloomsbury, a very important book that reminds us that Chi-Town is a central modernist site. She's also co-editor of Refocus, the films of Paul Schrader, coming from, I think it's forthcoming. It may already be out, from Edinburgh University Press. And she published a chapter in Hemingway and the Digital Age and is presented at the Ernest Hemingway Colloquium in Cuba. The International Hemingway Conference is in Venice and Oak Park, and Hemingway Society panels at the MLA and the ALA. And I may have forgotten to tell all three of you that your participation in this panel means your participation next summer in the International Conference in Spain is mandatory. So my apologies for leaving that out. So Michelle, I am going to throw the floor to you.
Okay, let me share my screen and get started. Okay. So my presentation actually dovetails very nicely with Julie's in a way that I did not anticipate at all. So I'm going to talk about Hemingway's relationship to the Little magazines as a personal one. And it's personal because he grew up right outside of Chicago in Oak Park, as everyone knows. And while there, he read the Chicago Tribune and the other Chicago newspapers. And he will become part of what was left, the ragtag end of the Chicago Renaissance, through meeting Sherwood Anderson when he lived in Chicago for 15 months from 1920 to 21. The little magazines that Hemingway would contribute to and continue to contribute to emerged out of a Chicago art scene. And it was over by the time Hemingway arrived. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chicago scene that Anderson was very much a part of and would introduce through stories to Hemingway. So in order to do that, I want to start about 16 years from Hemingway kind of arriving on the scene in Chicago back to 1913, because that's when really important things were starting to happen for modernism in the US. So tens of thousands of visitors flooded Manhattan's 69th Regiment Armory in the winter of 1913 to see the International Exhibition of Modern Art, or as it will become known very quickly, the Armory Show. Harriet Monroe, in her role as New York art scene correspondent to the Chicago Tribune, reported on the Armory Show in a series of articles. And here's one of them. In fact, it's the first one, New York Bedlam and Art, a show that clamors, February 16th, 1913. You've got to love Tribune headlines. Now, Harriet Monroe was extremely well known in Chicago and on the art scene at this point. When she was young, 19 years old, she championed for poetry at the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. And she went to the industrialists who were going to decide what was going to be shown at the fair and by whom and who would speak and who would get to put on a show. And this young woman said, we need to have a poem. We need to have an ode. And I know exactly who needs to write it, me. And she convinced them that not only is poetry important, but that she was to be the important poetess who would give the ode. Well, after about a year of back and forth in writing, she managed to give the ode set to music and copyrighted the poem and splashed on to the art scene. She will form the Little Room, which met in the Fine Arts Building, the first really strong arts group of artists in Chicago, along with her good friend Henry Blake Fuller, a novelist that doesn't get mentioned so much anymore. But Hemingway will mention Henry Blake Fuller in that Paris Review interview that he gave towards the end of his life. So Hemingway knew all these people. Hemingway knew about all of them from reading the Tribune, being part of just the Oak Park, Chicago art scene. It was in the air. And so what's worth noting in that previous review is that Monroe is ecstatic about the Armory show. She loves it. Not everyone did. In fact, most of the other reviewers at the Tribune were not fans. But Monroe absolutely adored it. And here she talks about the Americans who are adventurous enough to be shown. And it's more than one, it's several. So there are Americans participating in the avant-garde, according to Harriet Monroe, who is placing herself at the helm of things by trotting off to the Armory show and reporting back to Chicago about what is going on. Notice Carl Anderson sitting there. It's worth noting she mentioned Carl Anderson, and it's a shout out to her Chicago friend. Carl Anderson is Sherwood's brother, and it is to Carl that Sherwood came when he left Ohio to become a writer, to become part of the art scene in Chicago. And it's because of Carl that Sherwood was able to integrate into the art scene. Carl was important enough to be shown at the Armory show. And I think it's kind of neat that Monroe mentions him and gets that Chicago hometown painter in there. So as I mentioned before, her review is overwhelmingly positive, and she's clearly excited about this new and fresh kind of art. It is enthusiastic, she says, exuberant. It offers the glad hand to anyone, young or old, who has something special and personal to say in modern art. And its welcome is generous. Each man has space enough for all his moods. And she will aid in supporting the curators at the Art Institute of Chicago, as well as some gallery owners, in bringing 2/3 of the show to Chicago. The other third goes to the Fine Arts Museum in Boston. And it's not received terribly well here either. And the Cliff Dwellers Club, if you're familiar with them, even staged a satirical protest about this new kind of art. But Monroe is steadfast that this new modernist art is where it's at. So we can see where her own head is at, because 2 months later, she launches Poetry Magazine. She's 52 years old when she does this, and she's 52 saying this is fantastic new art coming to our world. So Harriet Monroe is always positioning herself at the edge of things, at what is coming, what is new. She's not resting on her own laurels, and she's not interested in art, the steadfast realist art that has been a part of Chicago and championed by those who say that Chicago is the American literary center. And in the first issue, which I just showed you, she writes the motive of the magazine. And we can really hear that she's positioning the magazine the same way she positioned the art show. The arts especially have a need of each an entrenched place, a voice of power. It's entrenched, a voice of power. She is speaking for the artists of the world who need a place to publish, a place to be, much as she saw the Armory shows providing for painters, sculpture, and later and then potentially musicians. They are, she says, housed in palaces in the great cities of the world. And every week or two, a new periodical is born to speak for one or the other of them. But poetry has been left to shift for herself. And I love that, herself. This is feminine. This isn't the hymn of the newspaper publication of her review, but rather it is herself, her magazine, feminine and female run. And this fine art is going to be given a home, a place to have a voice, and she will collect it in this new magazine. So I see these very much as fighting words. And when Poetry Magazine was thought about and spoken about, others did too. So now Monroe, by this point, had become good friends with Edgar Lee Masters, that poet we know, who also doesn't get spoken about quite so much anymore. And he was a kindred artistic spirit to her, and they met through Monroe's father's legal practice. Both Masters and Monroe's father were attorneys. And when Masters and Sherwood Anderson both arrived in Chicago, neither had the money nor the prestige to join the few groups that took literature and arts seriously that Monroe was really part of and had grown up in Chicago. Most of these groups still associated with the studios at the Fine Arts Building directly across from the Art Institute. These are located adjacent to the Auditorium Building on Michigan Avenue. The Fine Arts Building was originally the Studebaker Building, a carriage factory and showroom. And by 1895, the building proved insufficient, and the Studebakers decided to convert the building into studios and theaters to be an artistic and literary center. The renovated building opened in 1898 and became a hub for writers, artists, musicians, publishers, gallery society, and even Frank Lloyd Wright had offices there from 08 to 10. The Little Room started there. The Little Theater, which spawned the Little Theater movement across the US and which brought European theater, including Ibsen and Wedekind, to Chicago, was there. And this theater also provided a home for Maurice Brown and Ellen Van Valkenburg's avant-garde puppet theater. Francis Fisher Brown's bookstore was there, and it was there that he published the second iteration of the Little magazine, The Dial, which for a brief period was another Chicago Little magazine. Masters and Anderson, however, would become regulars at the 57th Street Studios, a group that found cheap housing in the converted old buildings of the Columbian Exhibition in Hyde Park. And so the boundaries, though, between the old guard and the Fine Arts Building and this new group in the studios down in Hyde Park would be porous. And so we can see people like Monroe traveling down there, going to the studios, hanging out with this younger group. And Sherwood Anderson would be a part of all this. Sherwood Anderson would there meet Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. And it was actually in these studios that Anderson and Heap would meet each other. Floyd Dell would be among this new group as well. And so Masters then will publish Spoon River Anthology over the course of 1914 under a pseudonym in Reedy's Mirror, which is a Midwestern out of St. Louis little magazine. The editor, William Marion Reedy, will out him in a few months, but I think it's really interesting he didn't just publish a Monroe's Poetry magazine. And the reason why is because Masters was deeply concerned how this new kind of poetry he was writing would affect his life as an attorney. He felt he was doing something edgy and not very commercial, and he didn't want that to affect his practice. Masters, and then later share with Anderson, which would imitate what Masters did in Spoon River Anthology and prose, would form the core of what would be considered this new school of Chicago writing, along with Floyd Dell and Carl Sandburg. This new generation of writers would form a modern collective response to an older, more popular, very commercial now, realism that was championed by William Dean Howells and published in all of the established magazines. So here's the first edition, an early edition, I couldn't get the very first one, of the Little Review. And notice it's published out of the Fine Arts Building in Chicago. That's where it started. And so the new Chicago writers and artists would be published by Chicago's new and modern Little magazines, like Monroe's Poetry and Anderson and Heap's The Little Review. And the Little Review is named after the Little Theater and the Little Room groups in the Fine Arts Building. And these little magazines would review and think about everything that was also being reviewed in the Chicago papers. And the Chicago papers would in turn boost anything that could raise Chicago's position in the artistic and literary markets. So the Chicago art scene would fuse together this literary avant-garde with the commercial market, making Masters and then Anderson almost instant literary celebrities. This is when that idea of the literary celebrity began. And they quickly found that they had to sell the idea of the Chicago Renaissance along with their books. And the avant-garde is this very kind of amorphous, difficult to describe part of that. It was difficult to describe for Anderson and Masters. So in November of 1916, we can see how far Masters has ascended as a literary celebrity, because this is the society pages. And you can see Mrs. Edgar Lee Masters there, his wife, who he'll leave a year later, and his children being positioned alongside British royalty, the heirs of an oil fortune, because this is everyone who's anyone around town. So it's kind of incredible to think of Masters, who didn't want to publish under his own name, being elevated to the status of celebrity and being in the society pages within the course of 2 years. But I argue and think that that's something that can only happen with this marriage of the avant-garde and this Tribune, boosting the writers and profile of Chicago simultaneously. This has not happened and will not happen anywhere else. So when Hemingway meets Anderson in Chicago in 1920, Anderson introduces him to everyone remaining in Chicago at that point, including Harriet Monroe. And he'll tell him about the others, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, and their little magazines. Now, yeah, Hemingway would have known about the Little Review and known about poetry before he met Anderson. But when he meets Anderson and Anderson's just telling him about his friends, it again becomes extremely personal. They are personal to Anderson, and they will become personal to Hemingway. And he'll live the rest of his life making these personal connections that in turn affect his publications, his publishing decisions, and actually I think a lot of his writing decisions as well. Well, in Chicago, he'll write 2 poems for Hadley, and then he sends them, actually very logically, to Harriet Monroe at Poetry to publish, and also to the Dial's newest version, which has been publishing Anderson quite a bit. The Dial is no longer based in Chicago, but because that name keeps getting recycled, it keeps getting connected to this well-known name based in Chicago. Hemingway is completely rejected. He doesn't get published at that point. But in 1922, after leaving Chicago and Anderson has moved to New Orleans, Hemingway will send out new poetry to the Double Dealer, where Anderson has recently moved and which Anderson is now affiliated with. And so, his poetry is 4 lines. And I find this fascinating because it's terse even for Hemingway. And above it, of course, is a longer poem by an also unknown writer named William Faulkner, but we're not talking about him today. So let's concentrate on Hemingway. He tried to spit out the truth, dry-mouthed at first. He drooled and slobbered in the end, truth dribbling his chin. And we can just compare that with a random part of Spoon River Anthology that I pulled. And I think the connections are really clear. Hemingway is not writing in dialect, something Masters was also not doing. And dialect is a huge part of the earlier regionalism and realism that Masters is writing against. There isn't flowery language, it's blank verse, it's pithy, and it's one consciousness. And I think what we're seeing is Hemingway's beginning to imitate Masters, because we know Hemingway wanted to be the best. We know Hemingway wants to be a literary celebrity. So who else to model yourself after but the literary celebrity, Masters? This is published on the next page after the poetry, and the Double Dealer is very tongue-in-cheek, showing how edgy they are as well, because Mr. H.T. Meggs of Clarks Hill, Indiana, is canceling his subscription. So whether this is true or not, it's, I think, an interesting performative piece that shows how self-aware these little magazines were, that they were doing something different, something edgy, or at least trying to do so. So in 1922, Hemingway will resend to Monroe at Poetry Magazine, and he will get published there in January of 1923. And of course, he's composing in Our Time, which will be published in the Little Review around the same moment. And here is an entire sheaf of more formal poetry, but it's still similar to what Masters was doing. And I think, since Julie went first, you can see in part why he'd be intrigued by what Stein was doing. And Stein would be a little intrigued with Hemingway's voice as well. And so Hemingway's main introduction to the little magazines was personal, because Anderson was friends with James Heath and Margaret Anderson and Harriet Monroe, and watched these magazines come into being in Chicago. It makes sense that Hemingway's first publications were in these magazines, along with the Anderson-driven Double Dealer. Hemingway will always bring Chicago with him, thinking about how to commercialize the avant-garde. His writing will forever fuse together that popular Midwest realism of Chicago writing, so heralded and boosted by the Tribune, with this more experimental European avant-garde. Thank you. Whoops.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. And I should mention, by the way, that as many of you know, the American Literature Association now meets in Chicago on the even-numbered years. So it struck me as Michelle was speaking that perhaps we could entice you to come all the way to Chicago this year and give those of us who really haven't done the tour of whatever remains of some of these sites. It's fascinating to think that they all kind of percolated right in this same building and same neighborhood and got going there. So hopefully we could get you to ALA this year and you can take us on a tour of Chicago. I'm sure there's a few bars in between there we could probably take a diversion into as well. Our third presenter this afternoon is Sarah Selden, and she recently finished her master's in English and American Studies at Pembroke College, Oxford, where her thesis explored the editing and publishing labor of Margaret Anderson and Sylvia Beach in relationship to Joyce's Ulysses. Before pursuing graduate studies, Sarah completed a Fulbright English teaching grant in Spain, and her research interests include genetic criticism, children's literature, and modernism. Her work's recently been published in Children's Literature and Education, the Children's Literature Association Quarterly, and the Hemingway Review. And I should mention that if you have the current edition of the Hemingway Review, so Sarah has a wonderful article in there about Hemingway's sort of editorial voice in the Transatlantic Review. And I highly recommend that. Maybe her greatest accomplishment that we should give her a Medal of Valor for is the fact that she currently teaches 9th and 12th grade English in Colorado and hopes to pursue further graduate study in the future. So Sarah, we are going to encourage you to teach Gertrude Stein to ninth graders. Perfect time to do it in this era where everybody is reading books. So without further ado, Sarah, if you want to go ahead and take the floor.
Thank you so much. I will take that recommendation. I think the 9th graders would love Gertrude Stein. Let's see. Okay. Did that work? Okay, so one of the first things we learn about Ernest Hemingway's protagonist in his parodic novella, The Torrents of Spring, is that he publishes stories in contemporary periodicals. He says, "I had a story in the Post and 2 in the Dial." David Earle argues that for Hemingway, just as for many other literary modernists, magazines didn't just give insight into the literary scene, they were the literary scene. By alluding to these magazines, Hemingway illustrates his own position as central to au courant literary fashion. So as Julie mentioned in her presentation, and which is so lovely that all of our presentations are dovetailing together so nicely, Sherwood Anderson introduced Hemingway to Gertrude Stein when he arrived in Paris in the early 1920s. And of course, it makes sense that Hemingway would seek out opportunities to be part of the modernist literary magazine scene that was happening there. Stein helped introduce Hemingway to Ezra Pound, who then introduced Hemingway to Ford Madox Ford. And in 1924, Ford Madox Ford was beginning his second little modernist magazine project, the Transatlantic Review. And so at Pound's suggestion, Ford took Hemingway on as a probably unpaid sub-editor in February of 1924. And I argue that this begins a significant but rather overlooked period in Hemingway's early career. So by serving as a sub-editor for the Transatlantic Review, it gave Hemingway the unique opportunity to work as both an editor of his work as well as a contributor to the magazine. So when he publishes 3 of his short stories in the Transatlantic Review, he can ensure that they appear exactly as he wants them to. He was a proofreader for the magazine, a copy editor, and also a typesetter. So these stories appear exactly as he wanted them to, which will become significant later in my presentation. He was also tasked with sourcing other fiction for the magazine, and perhaps his most important contribution was convincing Ford to serialize Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans, which she was really struggling to find a publisher for at the time, and that kind of embittered her toward other modernists, including Joyce, because she saw The Making of Americans as her Ulysses and was struggling that it didn't achieve the same commercial success. Hemingway admired it, though, and so he fought to serialize it, and he also became the typesetter of that because it was only in written manuscript form at the time. So he typed up all the passages that were serialized, and I'll argue that that becomes very important to his stylistic development during this time period as well. But before we get to that, we'll talk about some of his other responsibilities as an editor for the Transatlantic Review. He was also responsible for publishing what Ford called chroniques in a number of issues. And these chroniques are essentially just spaces for literary criticism to talk about the goings-on of Paris and of other modernist spaces at the time. And Hemingway really did not enjoy participating in literary criticism. This is the April chronique of 1924 that he wrote. And the first page is essentially him just taking down literary critics. He's upset with the practice. He doesn't find it authentic. And then he launches into 17 little segments that you can see here. And why he has so many segments is up for debate, but I think it's probably his way of kind of digging into some of the other chronique submitters who would write these lovely praises for other writers, and then add this nice little rule, the lines that you see there, and then switch subjects without really much transition at all. And so he does this very often in this, and I think it's kind of a way to make fun of that practice. And while these 17 segments may appear unrelated on the surface, when they are read in totality, they reveal Hemingway's early appraisal of the modernist movement. He, as I said before, sharply criticizes the critics themselves. He criticizes the Dadaists, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. And he also praises the writers, the artists, and even athletes. He talks about a lot of boxers in this chronique that he admires. And this elucidates the middle of the road modernism that he is starting to establish. He wants it to appeal to a broader audience, to people who enjoy boxing, to people who also enjoy perhaps the more highbrow work of Stein that he also respected. So perhaps most significantly in this chronique is the section that comes in the middle of the second page there. And that's where he expresses some early disregard for the Dadaist movement. And again, with little to no warning, after discussing a nameless, newly arrived American writer in Paris, Hemingway asserts that, quote, Dada is dead, although Zara still cuddles its emaciated little corpse to his breast and croons a little Romanian folk song written by Princess Bebesco, while he tries to get the dead little lips to take sustenance from his monocle. So, unlike the events that inspired the other notes that Hemingway includes in this chronique, this mention of Zara and Princess Bebesco is not prompted by marriage, by a publication, by an arrival to Paris, or any other significant event, really. He just takes this opportunity to convey his belief that Dadaism is constructed to appease to the upper class as a sort of farced, highbrow form of literature. And he does that by mentioning Princess Bebesco, who was a British high society writer at the time. So as he is working as an editor, he's kind of using this editorial space to begin setting himself apart from his contemporaries. He really does not like Zara. His work had been published kind of facing Zara's in a previous issue, and he really did not love that placement. And so he takes this opportunity to dig into them. And as Julie also mentioned, when Maddox Ford had to go to the United States during the time that the July and August issues of the Transatlantic Review were being put together, he put Hemingway in charge of the magazine. And that allowed Hemingway to really dig in and establish his own editorial voice. So as she mentioned, he cut out a lot of material that Ford had already sourced for the issue, including some work that Ford wrote himself. So that's a strong stance for sure. And he brings in the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, who, as we have already talked about, she is a Dadaist. So he doesn't like Dada, but he likes Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven's work enough to publish that. And here for you, I have on the left a poem by Zara, which was not related to the Transatlantic Review at all. It's just an example of kind of the work he did. And then on the right, I have one of the poems that he did publish in the July issue of the Transatlantic Review by Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. And I don't know why he found the Baroness's work more authentic or more worthy of publication than Zara's. I'll let you kind of read through those and make some assumptions. Baroness was a performance artist. She was, I think that the comment that Kurt made about her being a phony might come from that, because there's a story I read once where she made this grand entrance into a performance, like halfway through, like wearing this ridiculous outfit. So that is very much her. But Hemingway somehow found her worthy of publication. And perhaps a reason that he also did that was to upset Ford, as Julie mentioned, because he was in this space of throwing off the influence of his mentors. And so it also could just simply be, I know he won't like this, let's go ahead and do it. But how do we then sort of start to think about how his work as an editor influences Hemingway himself as a writer? And this kind of section of the presentation is coming from a piece I'm still working on. So I'd especially appreciate any insight that anyone else has to offer in this space. But by using Dirk van Hulle's theory of creative concurrence, I think we can start to look at how his editorial work influenced his development as a stylist. Now, creative concurrence makes the case that by looking at what else is on a writer's desk during a drafting process, we can gain insight into the epigenesis of that text. So by looking at what's on Hemingway's desk as he's working on these short stories that then become In Our Time, we can gain insight as to how and why he's developing the way he is. So in 1924, we know that Hemingway is working on the Transatlantic Review editions of Indian Camp, The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, and Cross Country Snow, because those are the 3 stories he published in that magazine. He's also working on the book edition of In Our Time, the lowercase title, which is just the vignettes that came out in 1924. And he's also typing and copy editing The Making of Americans. So all those 3 things are influencing each other. Then in 1925, we have the Bonnie and Liverite edition of In Our Time that comes out, and that's his first contract with a more popular publisher. That's kind of where he wanted to be. So that symbolized a shift in his career. And then in 1930, we have another edition of In Our Time that he publishes with Scribner's, who is his kind of ideal publisher to achieve the audience he wants. So, and because we have these multiple editions of In Our Time in particular, that gives us a really interesting space to look at the creative concurrence and the drafting process of these stories. So let's kind of start to dig into that. When we look at the Transatlantic Review edition of Indian Camp, and then we look at the 1925 Bonnie and Liverite edition of Indian Camp, they appear very similar. The only changes are really in how Hemingway punctuates the dialogue. And we know that, at least in the Transatlantic Review edition, the way he punctuates the dialogue is very intentional, because he is the copy editor, he is the proofreader, he is typesetting it, he's involved in all of that. So if you look in the top photo there, I have a passage from the Transatlantic Review edition, just a little bit down. It says, "I see," Nick said. Just then, the woman cried out. "Oh, Daddy, can't you give her something to make her stop screaming?" asked Nick. "No, I haven't any anesthetic." And then if you look down at the Bonnie and Liverite edition, the only changes are there are standard punctuation is added to the dialogue. So instead we get, "Oh, comma, Daddy, comma, can't you give her something to make her stop screaming?" And kind of why Hemingway first chooses to punctuate it non-standardly and then moves to standard punctuation is what is of interest here. And I think the reason he chose that non-standard punctuation to begin with is because he was working so closely on The Making of Americans. And that was really an influential piece of his textual ecology. And we learned that from a letter that he wrote to Edward J. O'Brien, where he says, quote, "I edited the July and August numbers of the Transatlantic Review for Ford and got him to publish Gertrude Stein's Making of Americans. Have you been reading it? I think it is wonderful stuff, but to get it, really, you have to read it as hard and as concentrated as though you were reading proof on it." Now, Hemingway was, of course, reading proof on it, and he really valued that. He admired her style, and because he was reading it so closely. So then when you look at how she punctuates her dialogue in the Transatlantic Review edition of the serialization in the July issue, you can see that it's also missing standard punctuation. That last sentence of the first bullet there, David, I say, you just say it what you want and I do it. He sighed and looked a little sullen. And of course, Martha, you know I do what I got to do for you and the children. You know I always do what is right for me to do for you and the children. Can't you see, Martha? I just came back to see it. And Stein does not use a lot of dialogue at all in The Making of Americans. It's a lot of just stream of consciousness, automatic writing. So when she does use dialogue, she doesn't add in the standard punctuation, and it kind of then blends into just the prose of her novel and its experimentalism. So then Hemingway then models that, I argue, in the Transatlantic Review editions of Indian Camp and of the other two stories as well, by saying, oh, Daddy, can't you give her something to make her stop screaming? That's also missing that standard punctuation. We also know this is intentional because he continues to use that non-standard punctuation in the other two stories he publishes in the Transatlantic Review. Here we have a passage from The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife. On the left, I have the Transatlantic Review editions, and then on the right, I have the 1925 In Our Time edition, and I've put the added commas in red. So it's still that standard, that non-standard punctuation, and then moved to the standard edition. And so how do we know kind of why these changes took place and that it's not, and like how Hemingway feels about them? Well, looking at his letters gives us some insight there. He was very particular about how the stories would appear in the 1925 Bonnie and Liver edition, as he makes clear in the letter that he attached to his signed publishing contract. He writes, as the contract only mentions excisions, it is understood, of course, that no alterations of the words shall be made with my approval. This protects you as much as it does me, as the stories are written so tight and so hard that the alteration of a word can throw an entire story out of key. Now, Hemingway is not talking about punctuation here, of course, but he is being very exact on how he wants these stories to appear. So then when he gets the proofs back with the commas added, his response is very interesting. He says, whoever did the editing on the whole book was very intelligent, and most of the changes of punctuation I agree with. Those I don't, I have changed the original form. My attitude towards punctuation is that it ought to be as conventional as possible. The game of golf will lose a good deal if croquet mallets and billiard cues were allowed on the putting green. You ought to be able to show that you can do it a good deal better than anyone else with the regular tools before you have a license to bring in your own improvements. So Hemingway's stance on punctuation has radically changed. He now wants to only use standard punctuation. He wants to prove that he has a license to bring in his own improvements, and he wants to move away from that experimentalism that his mentors Stein and Anderson and the rest represent. In another letter to Liverite, he says, quote, my books will be praised by highbrows and read by lowbrows. And that's what he's going for. He's going for that middle of the road modernism. And so we can see that how being an editor impacted Hemingway's journey from more of a high experimental modernism to that middle of the road modernism. While the changes between the stories and the Transatlantic Review editions to the 1925 editions may seem small and insignificant, they show the moment in his career where he breaks away from the generation that came before him, from the version of himself that published A Divine Gesture in The Double Dealer, which is a very experimental, almost surreal short story that's amazing. From the 1924 In Our Time, the vignettes, which Cohen called a genre all its own. From the experimentalism of the Dadaists that we saw him clearly reject in the Chroniques, and becoming really a truer version of himself. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. All right. Great. Thank you. We do have about 45 minutes. Now, I should say that Julie has to leave here in about 15. So we'll go ahead and pose some questions to her very quickly. I should mention that if you'd like to go ahead and start putting questions in the Q&A, we'll look at them right now. We've got 2 in there right now, and I'll just start with the first one before we get going. One of our anonymous attendees says on September 9th and 10th, the Printers Row Literary Fest will be held in Chicago. I was wondering if any of today's participants will be involved. Are any of you going to Chicago in 6 weeks or so to be part of this festival? No? Okay, well.
No, but it sounds amazing.
Yes, it would be fascinating, and I think the question arises from the importance that you all lay upon page design and typography and all of these elements of the visual formatting of the text that were very important. And Jessica, we'll get to Jessica Da Silva down in Brazil. We'll get to your question here in just a second. But Julie, since you're by virtue of alphabetization, first on our list, I'm going to ask you the inevitable Baroness question. What can her brand of modernism teach us? And does that in some way enlarge our understanding of Hemingway's own modernist experimentation?
Such a provocative and great question. And so I've been thinking about the connection between the Baroness and Hemingway, and I think there's so much work that can be done with these 2 writers. So what I'll offer today, I think when we're confronted with extreme experimentation in the way that the Baroness gives us, although I would argue Hemingway is that way too. I mean, I think, for instance, we're all so familiar with The Sun Also Rises that I think it's kind of hard for us to remember perhaps our first reading of it and how difficult that novel really is. But I think when we're confronted with something like the Baroness, who's writing Dada poetry, I think we have to be willing to accept what we don't know and continue on. And so it's experiencing the art and sort of understanding that we can get meaning from it. So even though she's a Dada writer, that in fact there's meaning to be had, but that we're going to have to wrestle with the text in the way that we do with Hemingway's. And so, initially thinking about these connections, I was thinking about The Wasteland and how The Wasteland also seems really inscrutable. And upon first reading of it, it doesn't seem to make a ton of sense, but the experience of reading it is such that we are able to pick up themes and tone and images and things that are really important in terms of the overall reading of that poem. There's a really great BBC documentary that came out about The Wasteland. I think it's called T.S. Eliot Into the Wasteland. And it's actually arguing that The Wasteland can be profitably read through biography, especially in recognition of the riches we have with the Emily Hale letters. And so I think in terms of thinking about biography for a long time, as a good modernist, I thought, oh, well, we don't really want to bring in like a ton of like biographical lenses, but the Baroness insists on it. So with her work, it is profitably read with biography, I think much as Hemingway's is. And so I think when we're reading like both writers, when there are things perhaps that we have to track down or something that we don't know, I think it's okay to kind of revel in that like unknowingness, and then we can track that down or map it or trace it in some way. But I think what they share, the more I've been thinking about this question is they do have this documentary impulse. And so for Hemingway, that came out of newspaper writing, and he cared very much about sound, clearly, as did Stein. With the Baroness, we're getting poetry that's sometimes called sound poetry, that it seems like it's so divorced from meaning that you're just supposed to, much like we had that with the ballet mécanique, like in the beginning, the sort of like discordant sound. Sometimes that's how the Baroness's poetry reads. And yet when we delve into it, there are all sorts of layers with her poetry. And, I'm reminded of that quotation by Hart Crane in which he says, and I wrote it down because I wanted to make sure I got it right, that the Baroness was a lunatic, but she was right about society. And so I thought, well, that's, because she was such a Dadaist. Irene Gamble cites her as Sarah rightly points out, America's first performance artist. I have a list of the ways in which she, as Jane Heap says, let's see, she was the only one living anywhere who dresses Dada, loves Dada, lives Dada. I mean, she wore false eyelashes crafted from parrot's feathers and porcupine quills. She had a bra made from 2 tomato cans tied together. She wore a postage stamp as a beauty mark. She shoplifted things and then, like, for instance, toys, and then wore these like little toy soldiers on her outfit. She attached a red tail light to the bustle of her skirt. She wore a bird cage with a live bird on it around her neck. I mean, she did all sorts of things that made her quite legendary in her own time. And I think when we think about Hemingway's life, I mean, he seems pretty legendary, like in his time too. So I think biography matters, and we're dealing with these like larger than life characters, people who become characters in their work. So I think biography is an interesting lens, I think, to apply to both of their work. But I do think they were both right about society, and there's some really interesting like social critique, really important critique in their work that I think is less obvious with the Baroness. But I do think they share that. I think they share a documentary impulse. And, they were really concerned about how their literature looked, as Sarah pointed out, but also read.
Great.
And I don't, so it's kind
No,
of a
that's
messy
perfect.
answer, but
I was just actually realizing that our membership meeting starts in 7 minutes, so we may rush the questions here just a little bit. So I want to make sure to get them all in, and whatever we don't get to, we'll invite the participants to kind of comment upon. But Michelle, I wanted to ask you, I'm very intrigued in your book. You devote a section to Fanny Butcher. And I think most of us know her through her reviews of Hemingway. But I'm wondering if you could talk just very quickly, what was her sort of orientation toward this experimental modernism, and where she sort of sits on the divide of the high middle brow cultures?
Well, Butcher was a journalist, right? And she very much wanted to be the literary editor of the Chicago Tribune. And so she joins the Illinois Women's Press Association so that she can get a job at the Tribune, and it works. Now, Burton Roscoe was already the review editor, the serious highbrow literary review editor. And they said, okay, Fanny, we're going to give you a column that's going to be about women. Do what you want with it. Well, she took it and pretty much dipped into every department she could find at the Tribune. And then she came up with the idea to write a gossip column for books. So she wormed her way into the position as literary editor by way of, popular ways of introducing writers, which is something we're familiar with today, interviews with them, talking a little bit of gossip about, who they come from, who they're interested in, and combining that with their newest books that she was promoting. When Roscoe was fired from the Tribune in 22, she got what she wanted and she ascended to literary editor. But by that point, her techniques were so popular, and she was a favorite of McCormick, who was running the newspaper, Robert McCormick, that she continued to do what she did. And she opened a bookstore where she was then capitalizing on the reviews that she was writing of all the Chicago writers that she thought were extremely important, and creating a name for themselves, not just in Chicago, but in the US. So Butcher is this really interesting figure who, in my opinion, violated some strong ethical lines. And the Tribune agreed, because she had to give up her bookstore in 1927 because the conflict of interest was too great. But she reviews the books, she boosts the books, and she becomes tremendous friends with all of these writers, Hemingway, Cather, Floydell, others, all these ones who consider themselves avant-garde, to advise them essentially how to get good reviews from her, as well as how, if we're going to be blunt about it, and also how to market their books in a more commercial way. She went so far as to really push Cather to name one of ours, her Pulitzer Prize winning book, one of ours. Cather wanted to name it Claude. She absolutely adored that name. Her editor said, you know what, that's a terrible name. Butcher, it's not good. Butcher says, one of ours. I think that would be a great name. And Cather's like, I don't really want to do it, but I'm going to do it. And it becomes one of ours. And Butcher says, see, I told you. But then Cather will continue to call it Claude for the rest of her life, because she was so married to that name and against that crass commercialism that Butcher so represented.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll definitely when you get to ALA do something on Butcher as well. I think she's wonderfully overlooked. We've got a couple other questions in the Q&A that from Steve and Don, and we will get back to you on those. But since we're up against the deadline, I'm going to ask Sarah her question, and it comes from your article, because you really seize upon a line that Ford Maddox Ford came up with, and so I'm wondering what the concept of pure literature. Do you what about the concept of pure literature do you think appealed to Hemingway? And what did he mean when he endorsed Ford's idea that it was quote unquote doomed?
Yeah, I think kind of Hemingway's movement through the Transatlantic Review is his kind of quest to define his own pure literature and what it means for himself. And I think that's why we see that year as being so important to his establishment of his own literary identity. You know, we see him pushing against Tristan Tzara, who he thought was a very inauthentic, unpure, if you will, writer. He did not like that form of Dadaism, but then he somehow found the Baronesses to be more pure, perhaps, or perhaps he just published her as a way to establish his own pure identity where he's not being influenced by Ford. I think he liked Stein because she strikes as a very pure writer. She's experimenting in a way that's very authentic to herself. And I think he liked the way she kind of lived her life as well. But then when he kind of discards her punctuation techniques and how she writes dialogue, he's then kind of casting off that and establishing his own pure technique and becoming a truer version of himself, as I mentioned before. So I think it's both. I think he's pushing against the performative nature of modernism. He doesn't like that. He would rather watch boxing. He's really interested in the pure art form of boxing than, you know, read the Dadaists. But he's also then trying to figure out what his own pure literature might be in his own voice. And I think that's the time period where he really is able to hone in on that.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, I think when I read your article, it really conveyed to me the idea that our notions of what is performative and then what is purity, aesthetic purity, really needs to be reinvestigated, and those chroniques are great devices for doing it. I really apologize if it seems like I'm rushing us through, but we do have a membership meeting over in another link to get to. So on behalf of the Hemingway Society, I just want to say thank you to Julie and to Michelle and to Sarah for giving your time and for giving us these great ideas. My hope is that everyone will go out there and do some exploration on some of these more tangential, only because we are Hemingway centric, but to look at some of these folks, whether they're in Chicago or in Paris or possibly even New York, and to really read Hemingway through the prism of the unexpected angles that they may provide. I'll simply wrap up by mentioning that I did include in the chat section a link to the to the Exiles issue of Little Review. And if you don't have a chance to copy it quite yet, we will make sure to include the PDF when we post the very polished video, edited video on the Hemingway website. So without further ado, I will say thank you again. We appreciate everybody that tuned in, and we will see you shortly in the membership meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.